Let me start with something that sounds like virtue but isn't. Honestly, some people don't stay quiet because they have nothing to say. They stay quiet because they learned very early that having something to say was dangerous. And when speaking feels like risk, silence feels like safety, even when that silence is slowly erasing them. This pattern shows up quietly in adult life. The person who nods along even when they disagree. The person who says "I'm fine" when they are anything but fine. The person who absorbs blame to end an argument quickly. The person who never expresses a preference because having preferences creates conflict. And they see what is happening. They feel the words forming in their throat. They feel the truth trying to rise, but they swallow it anyway. From the outside, this looks like maturity. It looks like diplomacy, like emotional intelligence, like someone who values harmony over ego. And there is thoughtfulness in it. But beneath the thoughtfulness is something else. Something older. A belief learned so early it doesn't feel like a belief. It feels like survival. The belief that speaking disrupts, that having needs burdens, that expressing truth shatters peace, that their voice, when used, causes harm. This is not about being polite. It is about what the nervous system registers as safe. Because here is what most people misunderstand. They think the person staying silent is choosing silence strategically, weighing options and selecting diplomacy. But that is not what is happening. The silence is automatic. The words form and then disappear before reaching the mouth. The thought arrives and is immediately edited, softened, or abandoned. This happens so quickly the person may not even notice. The silencing has become reflex. They feel the words forming. They feel the truth rising. They swallow it anyway. When you grow up in an environment where your voice created problems, where speaking your truth led to consequences, where expressing yourself made things worse, your nervous system learns a specific lesson. It learns that silence preserves connection, that quietness prevents chaos, that being voiceless is safer than being heard. So when an adult situation involves potential conflict, the system doesn't evaluate whether speaking is actually dangerous now. It responds based on what speaking meant then. And then, speaking meant risk. This is the part that confuses people who didn't learn this. They ask, quote 1, as if speaking were a simple act of opening your mouth. As if the words could just flow without the weight of everything that happened when words flowed before. But it doesn't work that way. Speaking is not just a choice. It is an act that requires the body to believe it is safe. And for someone whose body learned that speaking leads to loss, rejection, punishment, or chaos, the body does not believe safety exists when the voice emerges. So the voice stays down, not out of weakness, out of learned protection. There is also the exhaustion, not from silence itself, but from the constant internal process of editing, swallowing, suppressing. The person is not passive, they are extraordinarily active. They are monitoring every conversation, scanning every interaction, calibrating every response to ensure it doesn't create disruption. This requires immense energy. They are performing peace. And performing anything constantly is depleting, but they perform anyway. because the alternative feels more dangerous than the exhaustion. What if I upset them? What if this ruins everything? What if my voice matters less than their comfort? The internal questions sound like consideration, and they are considerate. But they are also the questions a child learns to ask when their voice was treated as a problem rather than a presence. When a child's attempts to speak were met with frustration, dismissal, anger, or withdrawal, the child does not conclude that the adult was wrong. The child concludes that they were wrong. Wrong to speak, wrong to need, wrong to exist so audibly. This is not a conscious thought. It is an internalized rule, and the rule is, silence keeps you safe, voice makes you vulnerable, peace requires your absence. And that rule doesn't disappear in adulthood. It transfers. The person who silences themselves to keep the peace is not avoiding conflict for strategic reasons. They are avoiding conflict because conflict, in their nervous system memory, was existential threat, not dramatic threat. The quiet kind. The kind where love felt conditional on compliance, where connection felt fragile and contingent on not causing problems, where being easy, being agreeable, being voiceless was the only way to remain tethered. This is why they may meet someone kind, someone who says they want honesty, someone who claims they value directness, and still stay silent. Because the pattern is not about logic, it is about wiring, and the wiring says, even in safety, speaking is dangerous. Even when invited, voice is unwelcome. Even when someone claims to want your truth, giving it will cost you. So they stay quiet. They nod. They agree. They defer. Not because they lack opinions, because expressing opinions feels like standing on the edge of a cliff. This pattern is not about a single relationship. It is about all of them. The romantic partner they never correct. The friend whose jokes hurt but they laugh at anyway. The family member who talks over them while they stay silent. The colleague who takes credit while they say nothing. Different people. Different contexts, but the same underlying dynamic. The dynamic where their voice is constantly suppressed to maintain someone else's comfort. And the maintenance of that comfort becomes their full-time job, but the job has no end, because the more they silence themselves, the more they are expected to stay silent. The pattern trains others to expect their compliance. Their quietness becomes part of how people relate to them. The agreeable one, the easy one, the one who never causes problems. And these labels feel like affection, but they are not affection. They are the rewards for self-erasure. And self-erasure, even when rewarded, is still erasure. This pattern begins long before the first word is swallowed. It begins in childhood, when a child learns that certain truths are better left unspoken. That lesson becomes a way of being, and that way of being determines everything that follows. How they navigate relationships, how they tolerate harm, how long they stay in situations that require their silence, how much of themselves they lose in the process of keeping peace that was never truly peaceful. And here is where the pattern starts to make sense. When you understand what this person learned about their own voice as a child, the silence stops looking like passivity. It looks like survival. The child who later silences themselves to keep the peace often grew up in an environment where peace was fragile. not absent, fragile. And their voice was the thing that could shatter it. Because when peace is stable, a child learns they can speak freely. When peace is absent, a child learns to navigate chaos. But when peace is fragile, when it exists only as long as no one disrupts it, the child learns something different. They learn to protect the peace. They learn to monitor their own impact. They learn that their voice, their needs, their feelings are liabilities. This is where silence is born. The child may have grown up in a household where conflict was explosive, where disagreements escalated quickly into shouting, slamming doors, days of cold silence. The child learned that once conflict started, it consumed everything. So the child learned not to start it. They learned to suppress anything that might lead to disagreement. They learned that their job was to be easy, to not add to the tension, to disappear emotionally if not physically. This is not a conscious strategy. It is adaptation. Or the child may have grown up with a parent who could not tolerate emotional expression. The parent who responded to the child's sadness with irritation. The parent who met the child's anger with punishment. The parent who treated the child's needs as inconvenience. This child learned that having feelings was problematic, that expressing those feelings created distance or disapproval. So the child learned to stop expressing, to perform calm even when they felt turmoil, to silence not just their voice but their eternal experience. Because if even feeling was too much, speaking was impossible. Some children grew up walking on eggshells, the parent whose mood determined the household's atmosphere. The parent who could be warm one moment and cold the next. The parent whose reactions were unpredictable. This child learned to become hypervigilant. They learned to read the room before entering it. They learned to assess emotional temperature before speaking. And if the temperature was unstable, they stayed silent. Silence became the safeguard. The thing that prevented making a volatile situation worse. Another version of this dynamic is the household where one person's voice dominated, the parent who talked over everyone, the sibling who commanded all attention, the family member whose needs always came first. In these environments, the child's voice was not explicitly punished. It was simply crowded out. There was no space for it. And the child learned that space is not created, it is given. And if it is not given, trying to take it is aggressive. So they waited for space. And the space never came. And eventually they stopped waiting. They just stayed quiet. There is also the child who watched another family member face consequences for speaking, the sibling who was punished for talking back, the parent who was criticized by the other parent for expressing needs. The child saw what happened when people used their voice, and they learned, not through their own experience, through observation. They learned that speaking makes you a target, that silence makes you safe, and they chose safety. Some children were explicitly told to be quiet, told that children should be seen and not heard, told that their opinions didn't matter, told to stop asking questions, stop talking so much, stop being so needy. These messages were delivered sometimes harshly, sometimes gently, but always with the same underlying instruction. Your voice is a problem. Silence is the solution. The child internalized this. They learned that their thoughts were not valuable, that their feelings were not important, that their needs were burdensome, and they learned to manage themselves accordingly, to need less, to feel less, to speak less, and less became their baseline. Another quiet effect of growing up in these environments is that the child begins to lose touch with their own inner experience, because inner experience is meant to be expressed. Feelings are meant to be shared. Thoughts are meant to be articulated. When a child is repeatedly discouraged from expressing, they stop noticing what there is to express. They learn to bypass their own feelings, to dismiss their own thoughts, to ignore their own needs before those things even fully form. This creates a disconnect. The child is not just silencing their voice outward, they are silencing their voice inward, and this internal silencing is where the deeper damage occurs. Because a person who cannot hear their own inner voice cannot know themselves. They become a stranger to their own experience. They know what others think, what others feel, what others need, but they do not know what they think, feel, or need. That information has been muted for so long it no longer registers clearly. So they become the person who says quote to every question about preference. The person who says quote 3 because they genuinely cannot locate their own want. The person who moves through life accommodating everyone because they have lost the ability to know what would serve them. This is not flexibility. This is disconnection. The child who grew up this way also learned a specific equation. Their discomfort is less important than others' discomfort. Their hurt is more tolerable than others' inconvenience. Their needs matter less than others' peace. This equation was not taught explicitly. It was demonstrated through experience. The child who expressed hurt and was told they were too sensitive. The child who expressed need and was made to feel demanding. The child who expressed disagreement and was told they were being difficult. These experiences taught the child that their internal reality should be suppressed to preserve external harmony. And they became very skilled at suppression. They learned to smile when they felt sad, to agree when they felt opposed, to say, "It's okay," when it was not okay. These performances became so automatic they stopped feeling like performances. They felt like who the child was, the easy child, the good child, the child who never caused problems. But this child was not easy. This child was terrified. Terrified of what would happen if they stopped being easy. Terrified of rejection, abandonment, anger, disappointment. Terrified that their authentic self, if revealed, would be too much, too needy, too sensitive, too difficult, too wrong. So the authentic self went underground, and the compliant self took its place. There is also the child who became the family peacemaker, the child who mediated conflicts between parents, the child who soothed siblings, the child who tried to keep everyone calm. This role often comes with praise. You're so mature, you're so understanding, you're so good at keeping the peace. And the child feels proud, feels valuable, feels needed. But the role also teaches the child that their value lies in managing others' emotions, that their purpose is to absorb tension and transform it into calm, that their own feelings are secondary to their function, and this role, though praised, is a burden no child should carry. Because children are not supposed to manage adults' emotional dysregulation, they are supposed to be children. But when a family is unstable, children step into roles that stabilize it, and one of those roles is silence. Silence as service, silence as care, silence as love. But silence is not love, it is self-abandonment. The child who learned to silence themselves does not grow up consciously thinking about any of this. The pattern operates beneath awareness. It is simply how they move through the world. They enter a room and immediately assess, is this safe? Can I speak? Will my voice cause harm? And if the answers are uncertain, they stay quiet. Not because they have nothing to say. Because saying it feels like risk. And risk, for someone whose childhood taught them that voice equals loss, feels unbearable. When this child grows up, they do not suddenly develop a voice. They bring the pattern with them. The pattern that says silence preserves connection. That quietness prevents chaos. That being voiceless keeps you safe. And this pattern plays out in every adult relationship they enter, with partners who never know what they truly feel, with friends who never see beneath the surface, with family who still expect them to accommodate, with colleagues who assume their silence means agreement. The child learned that peace was more important than presence, and the adult continues to honour that lesson, even when it costs them everything. This is not about choosing silence strategically in adulthood. This is about the body still responding to rules formed when voice equaled danger. And those rules, once learned, are not easily unlearned. They require more than understanding. They require the nervous system to feel safe enough to try something different. But safety for someone conditioned this way feels impossible when the voice is involved. And here is why. Because the silencing is not just cognitive. It is not just about thoughts or beliefs. It is somatic. It lives in the body. And the body, when it learned that speaking leads to harm, developed physical responses to protect against that harm. Responses that happen faster than thought. Responses that bypass conscious choice. Responses that shut the voice down before it can create danger. This is not weakness. This is how trauma works. Here is what most people misunderstand about staying silent. They think it is a choice made in the moment. In reality, it is often a physical response. The body shuts the voice down before the mind can decide. And the body does this because speaking, in its nervous system memory, equals danger. When the person who silences themselves approaches a moment where speaking might be necessary, their body responds, not with readiness, with alarm. The throat tightens, the breath becomes shallow. The voice, if it emerges at all, comes out shaky, small, or stuck. This is not nervousness in the colloquial sense. This is the nervous system activating a protective response. The body remembers what the mind may have forgotten. It remembers the feeling of speaking and then facing consequence. Anger, withdrawal, rejection, punishment. The body remembers that speaking led to rupture, and rupture for a child was threat. So the body learning to prevent speaking in order to prevent rupture, and that learning does not disappear in adulthood. The person may be in a meeting, about to share an idea. Their mind knows the idea is valuable, but their throat closes. The words that were clear moments ago become jumbled. They open their mouth and nothing comes out. Or what comes out sounds uncertain, apologetic, diminished. They sound like they are asking permission to speak rather than simply speaking. This is not lack of confidence. This is the body protecting them from perceived threat. Or they may be in a relationship preparing to address something that hurt them. They have rehearsed what to say. They know it needs to be said. But when the moment arrives, their body freezes, their heart races, their hands shake, the words they prepared dissolve, and what emerges instead is, "It's fine," or "never mind," or "I'm probably just overreacting." The body has overridden the intention, not because the person is weak, because the body believes speaking will lead to loss. And the body's job is to prevent loss. There is also what happens with the vagus nerve. This nerve is part of the nervous system's stress response. When threat is detected, the vagus nerve can trigger what is called a freeze response. This is different from fight or flight. In freeze, the body shuts down. It becomes immobile. The voice disappears. The person may feel disconnected from their own body, as if they are watching themselves from a distance. This is what happens for many people when they try to speak in situations that feel emotionally charged. The vagus nerve activates freeze, the voice goes offline, and the person is left mute, not by choice, but by physiology. They want to speak. The words are there, but the body will not allow it. Another somatic response is dissociation. When conflict arises or when speaking feels necessary, the person may feel themselves leave their body, not literally, but experientially. They feel far away. Foggy, disconnected. This is the nervous system's way of protecting them from overwhelm. If the situation feels unbearable, the system removes them from full awareness of the situation. This makes speaking nearly impossible, because speaking requires presence, and dissociation is the absence of presence. So the person sits through the conflict, through the conversation, through the moment where their voice is needed, and they are not fully there. They are somewhere safe inside themselves, and when they return, the moment has passed, the opportunity to speak is gone, and they feel ashamed for not speaking, not understanding that their nervous system removed that option. The body also responds to silence with relief when the person chooses not to speak, when they swallow the words, when they stay quiet instead of risking conflict. The body calms, the heart rate slows, the breath deepens, the tension releases. This relief is immediate and powerful. It reinforces the choice to stay silent. The body learns silence equals safety, voice equals danger. And each time this cycle repeats, the association strengthens. The body becomes more convinced that silence is the correct response, and speaking becomes more physiologically difficult, not because the person is becoming weaker, because the pattern is becoming more entrenched. There is also chronic tension. The person who silences themselves chronically often carries physical tension in specific areas: the jaw, the shoulders, the throat, the stomach. These areas become storage sites for unexpressed words, unfelt feelings, unvoiced truths. The body cannot release what is never expressed, so it holds it, and over time, the holding creates pain, headaches from jaw clenching, neck pain from shoulder tension, digestive issues from suppressed emotion, chronic throat discomfort. These are not separate from the silencing, they are part of it. The body is manifesting what the voice is not expressing, but the person often does not make this connection. They treat the symptoms without addressing the cause. They take pain medication, they do stretches, they manage the discomfort, but the discomfort persists because the unexpressed remains unexpressed. Another physical response is voice loss, not metaphorical, literal. The person may find that their voice becomes hoarse, strained, or disappears entirely during times of stress. This is the body making physical what is already happening emotionally. The voice that is being suppressed emotionally becomes suppressed physically, and when they try to speak, nothing comes out, or what comes out is barely audible. This is not a medical condition. This is a somatic response to chronic self-silencing. The person may also experience shaking when they do attempt to speak about something difficult. Their hands tremble, their voice quivers, their body visibly shakes. This is adrenaline. The body is in fight or flight. It perceives the act of speaking as a threat, and it is preparing to either fight the threat or flee from it. But the person is doing neither. They are trying to stay present and speak, and this creates internal conflict. The body wants to escape. The person is forcing themselves to stay. The result is shaking, visible, uncontrollable shaking that makes the person feel even more vulnerable. So they stop speaking, they apologize, they retreat. Because the shaking feels like evidence that they should not be speaking. But the shaking is not evidence of wrongness. It is evidence of how much courage speaking requires when the body believes speaking is dangerous. There is also what happens after they do speak. On the rare occasions when they push through the physical responses and say what needs to be said, even if the other person responds well, even if nothing bad happens, the person feels terrible, anxious, exposed, vulnerable. They ruminate on what they said. They analyze how it was received. They search for signs that they damaged the relationship. This is the nervous system trying to confirm its belief. It expects negative consequence, and when no external consequence appears, it creates internal consequence. The person punishes themselves with anxiety, with shame, with fear. The body generates the threat it expected to encounter externally, and this internal consequence reinforces the pattern. Speaking led to feeling terrible. Therefore, speaking is dangerous. Therefore, silence is correct. The cycle continues. Another element is hypervigilance. The person is constantly scanning the environment for signs of emotional shift. They notice micro-expressions. They track tone changes. They sense tension before it is visible to others. This scanning is exhausting, but it is also automatic. The body learned in childhood that detecting danger early allowed for protective silence, so the body continues to scan. And this scanning means the person is never fully relaxed. They are always monitoring, always assessing, always prepared to silence themselves if the situation requires it. This chronic state of alert depletes them, but they do not know how to turn it off. because turning it off would mean missing the signs, and missing the signs could mean speaking at the wrong time, and speaking at the wrong time could lead to the consequences their nervous system is desperately trying to avoid. So they stay vigilant and they stay silent, and their body stays in a state of protective activation that was supposed to be temporary but has become permanent. The body also learns to prioritize others' regulation over self-expression. When the person feels the urge to speak, the body simultaneously scans the other person. Are they calm? Are they open? Are they safe? If the other person shows any sign of discomfort, the body aborts the speaking. The other person's calm is more important than the person's voice. This is not a conscious choice. This is the body following the rule it learned in childhood. Preserve the other person's emotional state, even at the cost of your own expression, and this rule operates automatically. The person does not think, quote 9, the body simply makes speaking impossible when the other person's comfort is at risk. One of the most insidious aspects of this somatic pattern is that it confirms itself. The body believes speaking is dangerous, so it makes speaking physiologically difficult. The person experiences this difficulty as evidence that they should not speak, so they stay silent, and the silence prevents them from learning that speaking in many adult contexts is not actually dangerous. They never get the corrective experience, because the body prevents the experience from happening. So the pattern persists. The body keeps doing what it learned to do, keep them safe through silence. But the safety is an illusion, because the cost of chronic silence is the loss of self. And losing yourself is not safety, it is a different kind of danger. But the body does not know this. The body only knows that speaking once led to rupture, and rupture feels like annihilation. So the body continues to protect through silence, even when silence is the thing causing harm. And this is why telling someone to just speak up is not helpful. They are not choosing silence over voice. Their body is choosing survival over risk. And until the body learns a new equation, until the nervous system updates its threat assessment, speaking will continue to feel impossible. Not because the person is incapable, because the person's body is still operating on old rules formed when silence was genuinely protective. And those rules, though outdated, are deeply embedded. They live in the nervous system, in the throat, in the breath, in the heart rate, in the tension, in the freeze response. They live in the body. And the body does not change through logic. It changes through experience, through repeated experiences of speaking and surviving, through the slow realization that voice does not lead to annihilation, through the gradual building of safety that allows the body to release its grip on silence. But before that release can happen, there is the mind. Because the body is not working alone in maintaining this pattern. The mind participates. It creates thoughts, beliefs, narratives that justify and sustain the silence. And these thoughts feel true. They feel like reality. But they are interpretations. Interpretations formed in childhood and carried forward into contexts where they no longer apply. Understanding how the mind maintains the pattern is crucial, because the body and mind work together, and healing requires addressing both. One of the most painful aspects of chronic self-silencing is not the silence itself, but the thoughts that maintain it. Because the thoughts are logical, they are based on real experiences, but they serve the old pattern, not the actual person. The person who silences themselves engages in what could be called catastrophic forecasting. Before they speak, their mind runs through every possible negative outcome. If I say this, they will get angry. If I express this need, they will leave. If I disagree, they will think I am difficult. If I set this boundary, they will reject me. The mind generates worst-case scenarios automatically. This is not paranoia. This is pattern recognition gone into overdrive, because the person did experience negative consequences for speaking in the past. Their mind learned to anticipate those consequences, and now the mind anticipates them everywhere, even in contexts where the consequences are unlikely. But the anticipation feels like certainty, so the person stays silent to avoid the catastrophe that exists only in their prediction. There is also the way they take responsibility for others' reactions. If they speak and someone gets upset, they immediately internalize that the upset is their fault, not the fault of what they said being genuinely hurtful, but the fault of them speaking at all. They think, I should have stayed quiet. I should have known this would upset them. I caused this. This is learned responsibility distortion. In childhood, when a parent reacted poorly to the child's voice, the child had to make sense of it, and children cannot hold parents accountable, so they hold themselves accountable. They conclude that the parent's reaction was caused by their speaking, that if they had stayed quiet, the parent would have stayed calm. This creates the belief that they are responsible for managing others' emotional responses through their own silence, and this belief persists in adulthood. When an adult they care about becomes upset, they automatically assume they caused it by speaking. They do not consider that the other person's reaction might be disproportionate, might be about the other person's own issues, might be something the other person needs to manage themselves. They simply absorb the responsibility, and the solution in their mind is to speak less, to need less, to take up less space. Another cognitive pattern is minimization. The person minimizes their own needs, feelings, and thoughts. They tell themselves, it's not a big deal. I'm probably overreacting. This isn't worth bringing up. I'm being too sensitive. These thoughts serve to justify staying silent. Because if the issue is not important, then speaking about it is unnecessary. But the issue is not unimportant. The person is telling themselves it is unimportant to avoid the discomfort of voicing it. This minimization extends to how they interpret harm done to them. Someone says something cruel. The person's immediate thought is not, that was cruel. It is, they probably didn't mean it that way. I'm reading too much into it. I should let it go. They reframe the harm to make it palatable, to make it something that does not require response. Because response requires voice, and voice feels dangerous, so they minimize the harm to avoid having to use their voice. The person also engages in what could be called burden thinking. They believe that expressing their needs, feelings, or thoughts will burden others. that others do not want to hear what they have to say, that voicing their experience will be an imposition. This belief is usually not based on current evidence. It is based on early experiences where expressing needs was met with exasperation, dismissal, or frustration. The child learned, "My needs are a burden," and the adult continues to believe it. So when they consider speaking, they think, "But they don't want to hear this. They have their own problems. I shouldn't add to their stress." And the decision to stay silent is framed as consideration, but it is not consideration. It is the belief that their internal experience is inherently bothersome to others, and this belief keeps them isolated, because they do not share what they are going through. They do not ask for support. They manage everything internally, and managing everything internally is exhausting. But asking for help requires believing that their needs are legitimate, and they do not believe that, so they stay silent, and they stay alone. Another layer of the cognitive architecture is the equation they have internalized. Peace requires their silence. They believe that harmony in relationships depends on them not voicing disagreement, not expressing hurt, not setting boundaries. They see themselves as the variable that determines whether the relationship is peaceful or conflictual, and they control that variable by staying quiet. But this is not how healthy relationships work. Healthy relationships include disagreement, include honesty, include both people having voices, but the person does not believe this. They believe that relationships are peaceful only when no one is upset, and the way to ensure no one is upset is to never say anything that might upset them. So they edit themselves constantly. They calculate before every statement. Is this going to create tension? Is this going to make them uncomfortable? If the answer is yes, or even maybe, they do not say it. And what they do not say accumulates. There is also the fantasy of perfect understanding. The person believes, often unconsciously, that if people truly cared about them, those people would know what they need without being told. They should just know, and if they have to be told, it means the other person does not care enough to notice. This fantasy sets up an impossible standard, because no one can read minds, and expecting others to intuit needs without communication is a recipe for disappointment. But the person does not want to communicate their needs, because doing so feels like admitting the other person does not care. So they stay silent, and they feel hurt when their unstated needs go unmet, and they interpret the unmet needs as evidence that they are not valued, but they never voiced the needs. So the other person had no way of knowing. The cycle sustains itself. Another cognitive distortion is the belief that their authentic self is too much, too emotional, too needy, too intense, too opinionated, too much in some undefined way that would make them unlovable if fully expressed. This belief was usually formed when aspects of their authentic self were rejected in childhood. The child who was told they were too sensitive, the child who was told they asked too many questions, the child who was told they were being dramatic. These messages taught the child that their natural expression was excessive, and the child learned to edit that expression, to tone it down, to make themselves smaller, to become less so they could be tolerable. And the adult continues this editing, They never show the full range of their emotions. They never express the depth of their thoughts. They never reveal the extent of their needs, because revealing any of that feels like exposing the parts of themselves that are too much. And if those parts are seen, they will be rejected. So they show a curated version, the manageable version, the version that does not overwhelm or inconvenience or challenge, and they believe this version is more lovable. But this version is not them. It is a performance. And performing constantly is unsustainable. But they do not know who they are outside the performance, because the performance started so young. The person also engages in preemptive self-silencing. They do not wait until someone indicates they should be quiet. They silence themselves before the interaction even begins. They assume, based on past experience, that their voice will not be welcome, so they do not offer it. They wait to be asked, and often they are not asked, so they say nothing, and the silence confirms the belief. See, no one wanted to hear from me anyway. But they were not given the chance to speak because they did not take it. They waited for permission. And permission was not offered. Not because people did not want to hear from them, but because people assumed they had nothing to say. Because they had trained people through years of silence to expect their quietness. The pattern creates itself. There is also the exhausting mental rehearsal. When the person does decide they need to speak about something, they rehearse extensively. They script what they will say. They anticipate responses. They plan for every possible direction the conversation could go. This rehearsal is an attempt to control the outcome, to ensure that their speaking does not lead to the consequences they fear. But the rehearsal is also procrastination, because while they are rehearsing, they are not speaking, and sometimes the rehearsal goes on so long that the moment to speak passes, or the rehearsal is so exhausting that they decide speaking is not worth the energy, so they stay silent. Again. Another thought pattern is the immediate apologizing that accompanies any expression. Even when the person does speak, they couch it in apologies. I'm sorry, but I think... Sorry if this is annoying, but... I'm probably wrong, but... The apologies are automatic. They are preemptive attempts to soften the impact of their voice, to make their speaking less intrusive. But the apologies undermine what they are saying. They signal that the person believes their voice is an imposition. And others pick up on this. The apologies make it easier to dismiss what the person is saying, because the person is dismissing it themselves. This is not strategic. This is habitual self-diminishment. The person also has a running internal dialogue that evaluates their speech in real time. As they speak, a part of their mind is monitoring. Am I talking too much? Are they getting bored? Am I being too intense? This monitoring is distracting. It prevents them from being fully present in the conversation, and it creates hesitation. The person pauses mid-sentence. They trail off. They second-guess themselves aloud. This makes their speech feel uncertain, not because they are uncertain about the content, but because they are uncertain about whether they should be speaking at all. And this uncertainty invites others to interrupt, to talk over them, to dismiss what they are saying. which confirms the belief that their voice is not important, which strengthens the pattern. One more cognitive element is the way they rewrite their own reality. When their perception of a situation conflicts with someone else's, they defer to the other person's version. Even when they know what they experienced, even when they trust their own memory, if someone else presents a different narrative, they doubt themselves. This is not humility. This is learned self-distrust. In childhood, when they expressed their experience and it was denied or contradicted, they learned that their perceptions were unreliable, that others knew better than they did about their own experience, so they learned to defer, to accept others' versions over their own. And in adulthood, this makes them easy to gaslight, easy to manipulate, easy to convince that they are wrong even when they are right, because they do not trust their own knowing. They trust others' interpretations more than their own experience, and this keeps them silent, because if they cannot trust their own perceptions, how can they voice them? The mind, like the body, is working to keep the person safe, but the way it is keeping them safe is by maintaining silence, by creating thoughts that justify staying quiet, by generating fears that prevent speaking, by establishing beliefs that make voice seem dangerous and silence seem protective. But these thoughts, these fears, these beliefs, they are not reality. They are interpretations. Interpretations that made sense in childhood. Interpretations that may have been accurate then, but they are not accurate now. The contexts have changed. The relationships are different. The stakes are not what they were, but the mind has not updated. It is still operating on old information. And until that information is examined, questioned, and replaced with new information, the pattern will persist. And the pattern does not persist equally everywhere. It shows up differently depending on the relationship, depending on who is in the room, depending on what feels safe or dangerous in that particular dynamic. Understanding where and how the pattern manifests is part of understanding the pattern itself. The person who silences themselves to keep the peace does not silence equally everywhere. The pattern knows which relationships feel most dangerous, and in those relationships the voice becomes smallest. In romantic relationships, the silencing often becomes most pronounced, because romantic relationships are where attachment is most activated, and attachment, for someone who learned that voice threatens connection, triggers the deepest protective responses. The person may spend years with a partner who never truly knows them, who never hears their authentic thoughts, feelings, needs. The person agrees when they disagree. They say, "I'm fine," when they are deeply hurt. They fake enthusiasm for things they dislike. They suppress resentment until it becomes a dull, constant background hum. They never express what they want sexually, emotionally, practically. They mold themselves to fit what they believe the partner wants, and they call this love. But this is not love. This is self-abandonment masquerading as devotion. The person may also absorb blame to end conflict quickly. When an argument starts, their immediate instinct is to make it stop. And the fastest way to make it stop is to take responsibility, even when they are not at fault, even when the partner is clearly wrong. They say, "You're right, I'm sorry," just to restore peace. because conflict to them feels unbearable, and being right is less important than being connected. But this dynamic creates imbalance. The partner learns that they will never be held accountable, that the person will always back down, that conflicts can be won simply by waiting for the person to cave. And the person does cave. Every time, not because they lack integrity, because their nervous system cannot tolerate the prolonged discomfort of disagreement, so they surrender, and they tell themselves it's maturity, but it's not. It's fear. There is also the way they never state preferences. Where should we eat? Quote, 19. What should we watch? Quote, 20. What should we do this weekend? Quote, 21. These responses sound accommodating, but they are erasure. The person does have preferences, they are just too afraid to voice them. Because voicing preferences creates the possibility of disagreement, and disagreement feels dangerous, so they defer, and over time, the partner stops asking. Because the person never has an opinion anyway, and the person becomes invisible in the relationship, a supporting character in someone else's life. In friendships, the pattern shows up differently, but the core is the same. The person becomes the friend who is always available but never asks for anything, who listens to everyone else's problems but never shares their own, who accommodates everyone else's schedules but never states their own needs. They are the easy friend, the low-maintenance friend, the friend who never causes drama, but they are also the friend no one really knows, because friendship requires mutuality. It requires both people showing up authentically. But the person is not showing up authentically. They are showing up in a carefully curated way that ensures they will not be burdensome, will not be too much, will not require anything that might inconvenience the other person. And this makes them feel safe. But it also makes them feel alone. There is also the friend who makes jokes at the person's expense, the friend whose humour has an edge, who says things that sting, and the person laughs. They laugh even though it hurts. They laugh because not laughing would create awkwardness, would create a moment of tension, would require them to say, quote 22, quote, but they do not say it. They laugh, and the friend learns that this type of humour is acceptable, and it continues, and the person continues to laugh, and inside, they feel smaller and smaller. Some friendships are one-sided, the friend who calls only in crisis, the friend who vents endlessly but never asks how the person is doing, the friend who takes and takes but never gives. The person sees this, but they do not address it, because addressing it would mean voicing dissatisfaction, and voicing dissatisfaction might end the friendship, and ending the friendship feels worse than maintaining the imbalance, so they stay, and they keep giving, and they tell themselves this is what friendship is, but it is not. It is depletion. In family relationships, the silencing is often most entrenched, because family is the origin. Family is where the pattern was formed, and returning to family often means returning to the role the person played, the agreeable one, the easy one, the one who does not make waves. The person may have unresolved wounds from childhood, things that were said, things that were done, patterns that harmed them, but they never bring it up, because bringing it up would disrupt the family peace, would create conflict where there is currently calm, would make them the problem. So they perform the role. They show up for holidays and pretend everything is fine. They listen to the same criticisms they heard as a child and do not respond. They watch the same dynamics play out and do not intervene. They keep the peace by keeping silent, but the peace is not real. It is a performance, and the person is the one performing it. There is also the family member who still treats them poorly, the parent who is still dismissive, the sibling who is still competitive or cruel, the relative who still makes inappropriate comments. The person tolerates this. They do not set boundaries. They do not say, quote, 23, quote, because saying it would create drama, and the family would blame them for creating the drama. So they stay silent, and they absorb the mistreatment, and they tell themselves it is not that bad, but it is. And the cost of tolerating it is their sense of self. In professional settings, the silencing shows up as the person who never advocates for themselves, who never asks for a raise even when they deserve one, who never corrects a manager who takes credit for their work, who never pushes back on unreasonable demands. They stay late. They take on extra projects. They do whatever is asked without question. Because saying no feels impossible, because expressing dissatisfaction feels risky, because advocating for themselves feels aggressive, so they stay quiet and they are taken advantage of, not necessarily maliciously, but people take what is offered, and the person is offering everything while asking for nothing, so they are given nothing. There is also the meeting where they have a valuable idea but do not share it. They sit in silence while others speak. They wait to be called on, and they are not called on, so the idea stays unspoken, and later, someone else voices a similar idea and is praised for it, and the person feels angry, but they do not say, quote, 24, quote, because saying it would sound petty. So they stay silent, and they feel invisible, and they tell themselves it does not matter, but it does. The pattern also shows up in how they handle workplace conflict. If a colleague is difficult, they do not address it. They tolerate the behaviour. They work around the person. They vent to others but never to the person causing the problem, because confrontation feels impossible. So the dynamic continues, and the person becomes increasingly resentful. But the resentment stays internal. It never becomes external voice. What connects all these relationships is not who the other person is. What connects them is the familiar feeling of believing that peace depends on their silence, that relationships are maintained through their self-erasure, that being known is less important than being easy. The contexts change, the silencing does not. And here is what makes this pattern so devastating. It is not just about what is never said, it is about what is slowly lost. Voice, yes, but also selfhood, authenticity, trust in one's own perceptions. One of the most erosive effects is how this pattern quietly dismantles the person from the inside out. What no one tells you about staying silent to keep the peace is that you are not just withholding words, you are withholding yourself. And over time, when yourself is never spoken, it begins to feel like it doesn't exist. The first thing that erodes is self-knowledge, because knowing yourself requires listening to yourself, and the person who chronically silences themselves stops listening. They stop checking in with their own feelings. They stop tracking their own thoughts. They stop honouring their own needs, because paying attention to these things is painful when you know you will not express them. So they disconnect. They learn to bypass their internal experience, and over time they genuinely do not know what they think, feel, want, or need. Someone asked them a question. Quote 25. Quote 26. Quote 27. And they do not 27. And they do not know. Not because they are being coy, because the information is not accessible. They have spent so long ignoring their internal world that they can no longer locate it. This is not indecisiveness. This is self-abandonment. Another thing that erodes is identity. The person has spent so long adapting to others, moulding themselves to fit different situations, performing agreeability, that they lose touch with who they are beneath the performance. They know who they are in relation to others, the accommodating partner, the supportive friend, the easy employee. But they do not know who they are in themselves. Who am I when no one is watching? What are my actual values? Not the ones I perform? What do I believe when I'm not considering how it will be received? These questions feel unanswerable, because the self has been suppressed for so long that the self is obscured. There is also the erosion of authentic relationship. Because the person is not showing up authentically, they are showing up as a curated version, and people can only connect with what is shown. So the person has relationships, sometimes many relationships, but none of them feel truly intimate, because intimacy requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires voice. The person is lonely even when surrounded, because they are surrounded by people who know the performance, not the person, and the person feels this loneliness acutely, but they do not know how to bridge it, because bridging it would require speaking, and speaking feels impossible, so they remain lonely, in rooms full of people who think they know them, but do not. The resentment also builds. The person does not want to feel resentful. They want to be understanding, patient, accepting. But beneath the understanding is anger. Anger that they are always the one accommodating. Anger that their needs are never prioritized. Anger that they silence themselves constantly while others speak freely. But they do not express the anger, because expressing anger would create conflict. And conflict is what they are trying to avoid. So the anger goes underground, and it builds, and resentment, when never voiced, doesn't dissipate. It solidifies. The person becomes passive-aggressive. They agree to things and then subtly sabotage them. They say, it's fine, but their body language says otherwise. They withdraw emotionally while staying physically present. The resentment leaks out in ways the person may not even recognize. But it is there, polluting the relationships, creating distance that they consciously say they do not want. But the distance is necessary, because they cannot be close and silent simultaneously. The silence creates the distance as a protective buffer. Another cost is physical health. The body stores what the voice does not express. The person may develop chronic headaches, migraines from the constant jaw clenching that comes with swallowing words. digestive issues because the stomach is holding unexpressed emotion, chronic neck and shoulder pain from the tension of constant self-suppression. These are not separate issues, they are manifestations of the same issue. The body is trying to process what is never spoken, and it cannot, so it holds it, and the holding creates pain. The person may also experience depression, not the kind that is easily identifiable, the quiet kind, the kind that feels like flatness, like going through the emotions, like nothing matters very much. This depression is the result of chronic self-abandonment. When a person spends years suppressing their authentic self, that self begins to recede. And when the self recedes, life feels empty, because they are not living their life. They are living around their life, moving through it, but not inhabiting it. There is also exhaustion, chronic, deep exhaustion, the kind that sleep does not fix, because the exhaustion is not from activity, it is from suppression, from the constant energy it takes to monitor, edit, perform, from the vigilance required to never say the wrong thing, from the effort of maintaining a persona that is not true. This exhaustion is invisible to others. The person appears fine, functional, capable, but inside they are depleted, running on empty, barely holding it together, and they do not know how to explain this, because nothing visibly bad is happening to them. They just feel like they are disappearing. Another effect is the loss of opportunities. The person does not advocate for themselves, so they do not get the promotion, they do not get the recognition, they do not get the opportunities that require self-advocacy. They watch as others who are less qualified but more vocal advance, and they feel bitter, but they do not voice their qualifications, they do not make themselves visible, they wait to be noticed. And sometimes they are not noticed, and they internalize this as confirmation that they are not valuable, but they were not given the chance to demonstrate their value because they did not speak up. The person also loses trust in their own perceptions because they constantly defer to others' versions of reality. They begin to doubt their own knowing. They second-guess their memories. They question their feelings. They wonder if they are overreacting, being too sensitive, misunderstanding. And this self-doubt is paralyzing. Because if they cannot trust their own perceptions, they cannot trust themselves to speak accurately. So they stay silent. And the silence reinforces the self-doubt, and the cycle continues. One of the most painful realizations is that the person has spent years silencing themselves, and no one noticed. Or if they noticed, they did not question it. Because the person being quiet was convenient. It made things easy, and people appreciate easy. But no one asked. Quote 29, quote. No one said. Soft, quote. 30. No one noticed that the person never voiced needs, never expressed preferences, never set boundaries, because the person made it seem like they did not have any. And this realization is devastating, because it means the silence was not noticed as loss. It was accepted as normalcy. The person's absence was not felt because they were never fully present in the first place. And realizing this creates a very specific kind of grief. Grief for the years spent invisible. Grief for the self that was suppressed. grief for the relationships that were one-sided, grief for the voice that was never welcomed because it was never offered. This is not sacrifice, it is dissolution. There is also the way they have become a stranger to themselves. They look at their life and do not recognize it. The job they are in but do not remember choosing. The relationships they maintain but do not feel fulfilled by. The routines they follow but do not find meaningful. They have been so busy keeping the peace that they forgot to build a life that feels like their own. And now they do not know who they are. They know who they are supposed to be. The agreeable one, the easy one, the one who keeps the peace. But that is not a self. That is a function, and they are so tired of functioning. Another cost is the internal split. The person develops two selves, the external self that performs peace, and the internal self that experiences chaos. The external self that smiles and says, "I'm fine," and the internal self that is screaming. The split becomes so pronounced that they feel like they are living two lives, one visible, one hidden. And the hidden life is where the truth is. But the truth is never spoken. So the hidden life stays hidden, and the visible life stays false. This split is exhausting. It requires constant management, constant code switching between the self they show and the self they feel. And over time, the split feels permanent. They forget how to integrate. They forget what it feels like to be whole. The person also experiences a loss of agency. Because they never advocate for themselves, they feel like life is happening to them rather than being shaped by them. They feel passive, acted upon, without control. This is deeply disempowering. But the person does not know how to reclaim agency. Because agency requires voice, and voice still feels impossible. One more erosion is the loss of joy. The person has been so focused on managing everyone else's comfort that they have forgotten how to experience their own pleasure. They do things because they are expected. They go through motions because it is easier than explaining why they do not want to. But nothing feels genuinely enjoyable. Because joy requires presence, and the person is not present. They are performing, and performance, no matter how skilled, does not create joy, it creates exhaustion. There is a specific kind of grief that comes from realizing you have spent years silencing yourself, and no one noticed, because your silence made things easy for everyone else, not dramatic harm, the quiet harm of slowly erasing yourself to make room for everyone else's voices, and the person who was supposed to be protected by that silence was never them, it was you. And that grief, when it finally surfaces, is overwhelming. Because it is not just grief for what was lost, it is grief for the person you could have been if you had been allowed to speak. Grief for the relationships that could have been authentic. Grief for the life that could have been yours instead of the one you performed. This is why healing does not begin with finally speaking up. It begins with something more difficult. There is also the question that must be answered honestly. Why? Why is their comfort more important than my existence? Here is the question that haunts people who silence themselves. Why can't I just speak? And beneath that question is another more frightening one. What happens if I do? Because the silence is not random. It is not personality. It is protection. and their protection is guarding against something specific. The something is buried beneath years of pattern, but it is there. And understanding what the silence is protecting against is essential to unraveling the pattern. For many people, the deeper fear is not about the specific consequence of speaking, it is about what speaking represents. Speaking represents visibility, and visibility feels dangerous, because when the person was visible as a child, when they expressed themselves fully, they were met with consequences: rejection, anger, withdrawal, punishment. So they learned that invisibility is safer, and silence creates invisibility. If I am quiet enough, I cannot be seen. If I cannot be seen, I cannot be harmed. This is the logic, and it is powerful, because it is rooted in real experience. The person was harmed when they were visible, so the nervous system learned visibility equals harm, and the way to avoid harm is to be invisible, and the way to be invisible is to be silent. This is not conscious, this is deeply embedded survival strategy. Another layer is the belief that conflict equals relationship ending. Not just tension, not just disagreement, annihilation of the relationship. This belief is catastrophic. But it was formed in contexts where conflict actually was destructive, where arguments led to days of cold silence, where disagreement led to withdrawal of affection, where expressing dissatisfaction led to threats of abandonment. The child learned conflict is existential threat, and the adult still believes it. So when the person considers saying something that might create conflict, their nervous system responds as if they are considering something life-threatening. Because in the nervous system's memory, conflict does threaten life. It threatens connection. And for a child, loss of connection is loss of survival. The adult is no longer dependent in that way, but the nervous system has not updated. There is also the belief that their authentic self is fundamentally unlovable. This is the deepest wound. The belief that if people saw who they really are, those people would leave. That the real self is too much, too needy, too opinionated, too emotional, to something that makes them unacceptable. So they hide the real self. They show the curated version, the version that is agreeable, accommodating, easy. And they believe this version is more lovable, but this creates a painful paradox. The more they are loved for the curated version, the more certain they become that the real self would not be loved. So they stay hidden. And the hiding confirms the belief. If I am only loved when I am not myself, then myself is unlovable. But this is not truth. This is learned shame. Shame that was internalized when parts of their authentic expression were rejected. And now the shame operates as a cage that keeps the authentic self locked away. Another fear is the fear of being seen as difficult, as demanding, as high maintenance. These labels feel catastrophic, because the person has built their identity around being the opposite, being easy, being low maintenance, being unproblematic. If they start speaking up, if they start expressing needs, if they start setting boundaries, they fear they will lose their value, because their value, in their mind, is tied to how little they require. But this is not value, this is self-negation, and being valued for requiring nothing is not being valued. It is being convenient, but the person cannot see this. They believe that asking for anything makes them burdensome, and being burdensome makes them unlovable. So they ask for nothing, and they receive nothing, and they tell themselves this is fine, but it is not. There is also what psychologists call emotional reasoning. The person feels that speaking will lead to disaster, and they treat the feeling as fact. The feeling is intense. The feeling is convincing, so they trust it. They do not question whether the feeling is accurate. They simply accept it as prediction. But feelings are not predictions. Feelings are responses to old patterns, old fears, old experiences, and the feeling that speaking equals disaster is a response to past contexts, not present reality. But the person cannot distinguish, so they trust the feeling, and they stay silent. Another element is the fantasy of perfect understanding. The person wishes that others would just know what they need without being told. That if people truly cared, they would intuit the person's feelings, thoughts, needs. This fantasy is seductive, because if it were true, the person would never have to speak. They would never have to risk visibility. Others would just know. But this fantasy is impossible. No one can read minds, and expecting others to know without being told sets up inevitable disappointment. But the person clings to the fantasy anyway, because the fantasy allows them to avoid the vulnerability of speaking. If I never have to say it, I never have to risk them responding poorly. There is also a form of control in the silence. If the person never speaks, they can never be rejected for what they said. They can never be misunderstood. They can never have their words used against them. The silence feels like safety, because it eliminates certain risks, but it also eliminates possibility. The possibility of being truly known. The possibility of having their needs met. The possibility of authentic connection. The person is trading possibility for safety, and the trade feels necessary. But the cost is their entire life. Another layer is the way the person has confused peacekeeping with being lovable. They believe that the reason people love them is because they are easy, because they do not create problems, because they keep the peace. And they fear that if they stop peacekeeping, if they start speaking up, people will stop loving them, because the love feels conditional on their silence. But if love is conditional on silence, it is not love, it is transaction, and the person is paying with their voice to receive approval. But approval is not love, and the cost of approval is too high. The person may also fear being like someone else, someone in their life who spoke up and was deemed difficult, dramatic, problematic. The person witnessed this. They saw how that person was treated, and they decided, consciously or unconsciously, that they would be the opposite. They would be easy, and being easy would protect them from the fate of the difficult person. But protection through silence is not protection. It is erasure. There is also the internalized belief that their needs are inherently burdensome, not just when excessive, always. This belief is devastating, because it means the person cannot even conceive of having legitimate needs. All needs feel like impositions. All requests feel like asking too much. So they do not ask. They manage internally, they expect nothing from others, and they believe this makes them virtuous. But it does not. It makes them invisible. and invisible people do not get their needs met, because no one knows the needs exist. The person also fears that speaking will open a floodgate, that if they start expressing, they will not be able to stop, that all the suppressed anger, hurt, frustration will pour out uncontrollably, and this flood feels dangerous, feels like it will overwhelm the other person, feels like it will destroy the relationship, so they keep the gate closed, they keep everything contained, and the containment feels like control. But it is not control, it is pressure, and pressure, when never released, builds until it explodes or implodes, and the person is terrified of both options. One more fear is the fear of being wrong. If they speak and their perception is incorrect, they will look foolish. They will have created conflict for nothing. They will have damaged the relationship over a misunderstanding. This fear keeps them silent even when they are fairly certain they are right, because the possibility of being wrong feels intolerable, and staying silent protects them from that possibility. But staying silent also prevents them from ever knowing if they were right. So the doubt persists, and the silence continues. Beneath all of these fears is one core fear. The fear that if they speak, if they are seen, if they exist fully, they will be abandoned, that the people they need will leave, and being alone feels worse than being silenced. So they choose silence, not because they want to, because the alternative feels like annihilation. But what they do not realize is that they are already alone, because they are in relationships where no one knows them, where they are performing constantly, where they are never authentically present. The abandonment they fear is not future possibility, it is current reality. They have abandoned themselves, and that abandonment is the deepest loss. So the silence is not about keeping the peace, it is about preventing abandonment. The belief that if they are quiet enough, agreeable enough, unproblematic enough, people will stay. But people staying while you are silenced is not connection, it is proximity. And proximity without presence is loneliness. But recognizing this requires something the person has been avoiding. It requires acknowledging the cost. It requires grieving what has been lost. It requires accepting that the silence, though it felt protective, has been harmful, and that acceptance is terrifying, because it means everything they have done to keep themselves safe has actually been making them unsafe. This is why healing requires something that feels impossible at first, not finding your perfect words, finding permission to have words at all. There is also the beginning of the shift, which does not feel like empowerment. It feels like terror. Healing from chronic self-silencing does not begin with a brave declaration. It begins with a whisper. The kind of whisper you can barely hear yourself. The kind that says, Testi, quote, 32. The person does not wake up one day and suddenly have their voice back. The voice returns gradually, tentatively, in moments so small they might not even be noticed by others, but they are monumental for the person experiencing them. The shift often begins with exhaustion, the kind of exhaustion that makes silence feel more costly than speaking. The person has been performing peace for so long that they cannot do it anymore, not because they have suddenly found courage, because they have run out of capacity to suppress, And exhaustion, though it feels like weakness, is often the beginning of change. The person might be in a conversation where they usually nod along, and they feel the familiar urge to agree even though they disagree. And for the first time, they do not agree. They do not voice their disagreement either, but they do not perform agreement. They just stay neutral. And even this small act feels seismic, because it is the first crack in the pattern. Or they might be asked their preference, and instead of saying, quote, 33, they pause, and in the pause, they actually check in with themselves, and they find a preference, and maybe they do not voice it, but they know it exists, and knowing it exists is the beginning, because you cannot voice what you do not know you feel. The healing often involves grief for the years spent silent, grief for the relationships that never became authentic, grief for the person they could have been if they had been allowed to speak. This grief is heavy. It comes in waves. Some days it is overwhelming. Some days it is just a dull ache. But it needs to be felt, because grief is how the body releases what it has been carrying. The person may cry in ways that surprise them, not tidy crying, but the kind that comes from deep in the body, the kind that is not about a specific incident, but about years of accumulation, years of swallowed words, years of suppressed feelings, years of performing peace while experiencing internal chaos. And the crying is not weakness, it is honesty. The body finally expressing what the voice could not. Another part of healing is learning to tolerate the discomfort that comes with speaking. Because when the person does start to use their voice, even in small ways, the discomfort is intense. The throat tightens, the heart races, the body shakes, all the familiar physiological responses appear, and the temptation is to stop, to retreat back into silence, to say, quote, 34, but healing requires staying with the discomfort. Not overriding it with force, but sitting with it, acknowledging it, and speaking anyway, not perfectly, not confidently, but authentically. And each time the person does this, each time they speak despite the discomfort, the nervous system learns something new. It learns that speaking does not always lead to catastrophe. It learns that discomfort is not the same as danger. It learns that voice can coexist with connection. This learning is slow. The nervous system does not update quickly. But with repeated experiences of speaking and surviving, the pattern begins to shift. The person also needs to practice with small truths first, not the big accumulated resentments, but small, low-stakes truths. Quote, 35, quote, 36, quote, 37. These feel enormous to someone who has spent years never expressing preferences, but they are small enough that if they go poorly, the consequence is manageable. And when they go well, when the person expresses a preference and the other person accepts it without issue, the person learns something crucial. They learn that their voice does not destroy things. Another crucial step is finding or creating safe relationships where voice is welcomed. Not everyone can hold the person's voice. Some people have been benefiting from the person's silence, and when the person starts to speak, those people will resist. They will call the person difficult, dramatic, changed. This is painful. But it is also information. It is information about who can tolerate the real person and who can only tolerate the performance. The person needs to find people who want to hear them, who ask questions, who create space for expression, who validate the difficulty of finding voice after years of silence. These people are not always easy to find, but they exist, and in these relationships, the person can practice speaking without editing, practice expressing needs without apologizing, practice disagreeing without catastrophizing. These relationships become the laboratory for healing. The person also needs to learn that conflict does not equal relationship ending, that disagreement can coexist with connection, that expressing dissatisfaction does not mean rejection. This is terrifying, because their entire nervous system has been organized around the opposite belief, but they need experiences of conflict that do not lead to abandonment, experiences of expressing hurt and being heard, experiences of setting a boundary and the relationship surviving. These experiences slowly teach the nervous system a new rule. Conflict is not annihilation. Conflict is communication, and communication, though uncomfortable, is necessary for authentic relationship. There is also the work of reconnecting with the internal self. The person has spent so long disconnected from their own experience that they need to relearn how to listen inward. This means pausing throughout the day and asking, how do I feel? What do I need? What do I think about this? At first, these questions may yield nothing. The internal world has been muted for so long that it does not respond immediately. But with consistent attention, with repeated checking in, the internal world begins to speak again, quietly at first, but it speaks, and listening to it, honoring what it says even when it is inconvenient, is essential, because the person is rebuilding trust with themselves, trust that was broken every time they silenced their own knowing in favor of someone else's comfort. Another element of healing is learning to tolerate others' discomfort. This is one of the hardest parts, because the person has been conditioned to manage others' emotions, to prevent upset, to smooth over tension. When they speak and someone else becomes uncomfortable, their immediate instinct is to take it back, to fix it, to restore the other person's comfort. But healing requires resisting this instinct. It requires letting the other person experience their own discomfort. It requires trusting that the other person can manage their own emotions. It requires recognizing that they are not responsible for others' reactions. This feels cruel at first, because the person's entire identity has been built on preventing others' discomfort. But it is not cruel, it is boundary, and boundary is necessary for mutual relationship. The person may also need to grieve the relationships that do not survive their voice. Some people will not accept the shift. They liked the person silent. They benefited from the person's accommodation, and when the person starts to speak up, to set boundaries, to express needs, these people will leave, and this is painful. It confirms the fear. It feels like proof that voice leads to abandonment. But these relationships were not sustainable. They were based on the person's erasure, and relationships that require your erasure are not relationships. They are extractions. Losing them is not loss, it is liberation. But it does not feel like liberation at first. It feels like confirmation of the deepest fear. So the person needs support to stay the course, to not retreat back into silence, to trust that the relationships that end were not serving them, and that space will open for relationships that can. One of the most powerful moments in healing is when the person speaks and nothing catastrophic happens. The other person listens, the other person responds reasonably, the relationship continues, and the person realizes that the fear was bigger than the reality. This is not about being reckless with voice. It is about learning that voice, when used authentically, is not the weapon the nervous system believed it to be. And each time the person has this experience, the fear lessens, not completely, but incrementally. The healing also involves self-compassion. The person has likely spent years judging themselves for staying silent, calling themselves weak, cowardly, pathetic. This internal cruelty is part of the pattern, and it needs to be addressed. The person needs to learn to speak to themselves with the kindness they offer others, to recognize that the silence was not weakness, it was survival, and survival strategies that worked in childhood do not deserve shame. They deserve understanding. And from understanding comes the possibility of change. The person also needs to accept that the healing is not linear. There will be days when their voice is present, and days when it disappears again, days when they set boundaries, and days when they revert to silence. This is normal. This is how patterns unravel, not all at once, in fits and starts, and the setbacks are not failures, they are part of the process. Each time the person recognizes that they have fallen back into silence, they have an opportunity to choose differently next time. The recognition itself is progress. Another part of healing is redefining what peace means, because the person has believed that peace requires their silence, that harmony depends on their accommodation. But real peace is not the absence of conflict. Real peace is the presence of authenticity. Real peace is when both people can speak, when both people can disagree, when both people can express needs, and the relationship does not shatter. That is peace, not the fragile, performed peace the person has been maintaining, but solid, mutual peace. And learning to value this kind of peace over the old kind is essential. The person may also need to practice saying no. This word has likely been absent from their vocabulary. They say yes to things they do not want to do. They say yes to avoid disappointing others. They say yes because saying no feels impossible. But no is a complete sentence. And learning to use it, learning to tolerate the discomfort that comes after using it, is crucial. Because no is how boundaries are maintained, and boundaries are how selfhood is protected. The first no's are terrifying. The person may shake, may apologize, may immediately want to take it back. But if they can stay with the no, if they can let it stand, they learn something vital. They learn that no does not destroy them, and it does not destroy the relationship. It simply clarifies where they end and the other person begins. There is also the practice of voicing feelings in real time instead of accumulating them. The person has a history of suppressing feelings until they become unmanageable, until the resentment is so large it cannot be spoken without exploding. But healing involves learning to express smaller feelings as they arise. That comment hurt me. I felt dismissed just now. I am uncomfortable with this. These statements feel enormous, but they are manageable. And expressing feelings in real time prevents the accumulation, prevents the build-up, prevents the silent resentment that poisons from within. The healing does not happen all at once. It happens in small moments of choosing truth over comfort, not perfectly, not without fear, but gradually, gently, with awareness. And each small truth spoken builds something new, not confidence exactly, permission to exist as they are, not as they think they should be. And that permission is the opposite of silence. It is the first word of a new language, the language of self. And one day, without noticing exactly when it happened, something shifts. The question is no longer, is it safe to speak? It becomes something quieter, something more honest. The person who once silenced themselves to keep the peace does not become someone who speaks recklessly. They become someone who speaks truthfully. They learn the difference, and the difference changes everything. They learn that speaking is not the same as being aggressive, that expressing needs is not the same as being demanding, that disagreeing is not the same as being difficult. They learn that their voice, when used authentically, is not a weapon. It is a presence, and presence, though it feels vulnerable, is where connection lives. The person begins to notice when they are about to silence themselves. They feel the familiar contraction, the urge to swallow the words. And instead of automatically obeying that urge, they pause, they check in. Is this silence serving me? Or is it serving the old pattern? And sometimes they choose silence. But now it is strategic silence. Chosen silence, not reflexive suppression. The difference matters. They also begin to tolerate the discomfort that comes when they speak and someone else is upset. They do not immediately rush to fix it. They do not take back what they said. They let the discomfort exist. They trust that the other person can manage their own emotions. And this is revolutionary, because it means they are no longer responsible for everyone else's emotional state. They are only responsible for their own honesty. The person starts to notice that some relationships improve when they start using their voice. The people who truly care respond well. They appreciate the honesty. They adjust their behavior. They create space for the person's authentic expression. These relationships become deeper, more mutual, more real. And the person realizes that the connection they were trying to preserve through silence was not real connection. It was performance. Real connection requires both people showing up authentically, and authenticity requires voice. There are also relationships that do not survive the person's voice. And this is painful, but it is also clarifying. Because these relationships were dependent on the person's silence, and relationships that require your silence are not relationships worth maintaining. The person grieves these losses, but they also feel relief, because they are no longer performing. They are no longer managing everyone else's comfort at the expense of their own existence. They are simply being, and being, though unfamiliar, feels more honest than any performance ever did. The person also begins to recognize their own preferences again. They know what they want to eat, what they want to watch, how they want to spend their time. These small knowings feel significant because they represent the return of the internal self that was silenced for so long, and voicing these preferences becomes easier, not effortless, but possible. Another shift is that the person becomes less afraid of conflict, not because conflict is enjoyable, but because they have learned that conflict does not equal annihilation. That disagreement can lead to understanding. That tension can lead to resolution. Conflict is no longer existential threat. It is communication. And this shift allows them to address issues as they arise instead of suppressing them until they become unmanageable. The person also learns to apologize less. They stop prefacing their statements with, quote, 42. They stop apologizing for existing. They speak without diminishing themselves, and this feels strange at first, but it also feels empowering, because they are claiming space, not aggressively, but unapologetically. There is also the relief of being known. When the person starts to show up authentically, when they stop performing and start speaking, some people begin to see them, really see them, and this is terrifying, but it is also deeply satisfying, because being known feels different than being tolerated. Being known means someone sees the real you and chooses to stay, and that is what the person has wanted all along. Not people who stay because they are easy, people who stay because of who they are. The person also begins to trust themselves again. They trust their perceptions, they trust their feelings, they trust their knowing. This self-trust was eroded through years of deferring to others, but it can be rebuilt, and rebuilding it means honouring what they know, even when others disagree, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it creates tension. Their knowing matters, and treating it as if it matters is essential. One of the most significant changes is that the person stops equating love with silence. They stop believing that being loved requires being voiceless. They start to understand that real love includes their voice. That real love welcomes their needs, their feelings, their thoughts, and any relationship that requires their silence is not love. It is control, or convenience, or extraction. But it is not love. This realization is painful, because it means some relationships they thought were loving were not. But it is also liberating, because it means they can stop trying to earn love through erasure. They can start seeking love that includes their presence. The person almost becomes more comfortable with being imperfect, with saying the wrong thing sometimes, with needing to repair, with not always getting it right. Because perfection was part of the old pattern, the belief that they had to be perfect to be acceptable. But perfection is impossible, and striving for it kept them silent. Because if they could not say it perfectly, they did not say it at all. Now they can say it imperfectly. They can stumble through difficult conversations. They can express themselves clumsily. And that is okay, because the goal is not perfection. The goal is presence. The final shift happens when the person realizes something quietly transformative. They realize that the peace they were trying to keep was not peace at all. It was silence, and silence is not peace. Silence is absence. Real peace includes their voice. Real peace allows for disagreement. Real peace is built on honesty, not suppression. And the peace they have now, with their voice present, is more fragile in some ways. It requires more navigation, more communication, more effort from both people, but it is real, and real peace, though less smooth than performed peace, is infinitely more valuable. The child who learned that silence preserves connection grew into an adult who believed that being quiet meant being loved. But that child can learn something new now. Not that speaking is always easy. That silence, when chosen from fear, is its own kind of violence. The voice they kept quiet to keep the peace was practice. Practice for the moment they would finally speak, not to be heard by others, but to be honest with themselves. And that moment, when it comes, is not loud, it is quiet. It is simply the decision to stop performing peace and to start inhabiting truth. And truth, though frightening, is where the actual person lives, not the version that keeps everyone comfortable. The one who existed before they learned that existing required silence. And that person, the one they've been hiding to keep the peace, has been waiting. Not for permission to speak, for permission to exist. The permission to exist does not arrive as a grand revelation. It arrives in small, almost imperceptible moments. Moments that feel insignificant to anyone watching but are monumental for the person experiencing them. The person is at dinner with friends, someone suggests a restaurant, and instead of immediately agreeing, the person pauses, they check inward, and they realize they do not want to go to that restaurant. And for the first time, they say it. Actually, I would prefer somewhere else. The words come out shaky. The person's heart races. They brace for rejection, for irritation, for the friendship to crack. But the friend says, quote, 44, quote, and the person realizes that the catastrophe they anticipated exists only in their nervous system's memory, not in present reality. These moments accumulate slowly. The person says no to a request for help when they do not have capacity. They express discomfort when a joke crosses a line. They name their tiredness instead of pretending to have energy. Each small expression feels like stepping onto unstable ground. The ground holds, and slowly the person begins to trust it. But the trust does not come easily, because for every moment of successful expression, there are moments when the old pattern reasserts itself. The person finds themselves nodding along to something they disagree with, saying yes when they mean no, performing peace when they feel discord, and afterwards they feel shame. They think, I did it again. I reverted. I am not healing. But this is not failure. This is how deeply ingrained patterns unravel, not in a straight line, in spirals. The person keeps encountering the same situations, the same triggers, the same urges to silence themselves, but each time they have a chance to choose differently, and sometimes they do, and sometimes they do not. And both outcomes are part of the process. There is also what happens in the relationships where the person starts to use their voice. Some people adjust easily. They welcome the honesty. They appreciate knowing what the person actually thinks, feels, wants. These people say things like, I always wondered what you really thought, or I wish you had told me sooner. And the person realizes that their silence was not protecting these relationships, it was limiting them, but other people resist. They are uncomfortable with the shift. They like the person agreeable, accommodating, silent. And when the person starts to speak up, these people respond with subtle or overt attempts to restore the old dynamic. They say things like, "You've changed," or "You used to be so easygoing," or "Why are you being so difficult lately?" These comments sting because they confirm the fear. They suggest that the person's voice is a problem, that speaking makes them less lovable, and the temptation is to retreat, to go back to being easy, to silence themselves again to restore the comfort of the relationship. But doing this now feels different. Because the person knows what silence costs. They have tasted what it feels like to be honest. And going back to performance, once you have experienced authenticity, feels unbearable in a new way, so the person faces a choice: continue speaking and risk the relationship ending, or return to silence and preserve the relationship but lose themselves again. This is not an easy choice. This is the choice that determines whether healing continues or whether the pattern re-establishes itself. Some people choose silence again. The fear of abandonment is too strong. The discomfort of others' disapproval is too painful, and they retreat. They tell themselves it is not worth it. That speaking up is not as important as maintaining connection. And the pattern, though briefly interrupted, returns, but others choose differently. They choose their voice even when it costs them the relationship. And this feels terrible at first. It feels like proof that voice leads to loss. But over time, something else emerges. Space. Space that was previously occupied by relationships that required their erasure. And in that space, different kinds of relationships become possible. Relationships where their voice is welcomed, where their needs are considered, where their authentic expression is valued rather than tolerated. These relationships feel different. They feel less intense in some ways. There is not the constant tension of managing someone else's comfort. There is not the familiar cycle of suppression and resentment. There is just presence, mutual presence. And at first, this feels flat, because the person's nervous system is still calibrated to intensity, still searching for the familiar discomfort of self-abandonment. And when that discomfort is absent, the system scans for what is wrong. It interprets the ease as evidence that the relationship is shallow, that it does not matter as much, that it is not real. But this interpretation is the old pattern speaking, the old belief that suffering equals depth, that if a relationship is not difficult, it is not meaningful. And unlearning this belief takes time. The person has to sit with the discomfort of ease, has to tolerate the feeling that something is missing when what is missing is the familiar pain, has to learn that relationships can be nourishing without being depleting, that care can be consistent without being earned, that love can exist without constant vigilance. This relearning is subtle. It does not happen through grand gestures. It happens through the daily practice of speaking small truths and experiencing small acceptances, through the accumulation of moments where voice is used and connection persists. And slowly the nervous system begins to update its understanding, begins to recognize that ease is not a threat, that presence is safer than performance, that being known is more valuable than being tolerated. But even as this shift occurs, there are moments of profound loneliness, because the person is between worlds. They are no longer able to participate in relationships that require their silence, but they have not yet fully integrated into relationships that welcome their voice. They are in transition, and transition is isolating. The person may look around and realize they do not fit anywhere the way they used to. The old relationships feel false, the new relationships feel tentative, and they are alone in a way they have not been before. Not the aloneness of being surrounded by people who do not know you, but the aloneness of choosing yourself over connection. And this aloneness is frightening, because it confirms the fear that has driven the silence all along, that if they choose themselves, they will be alone. And now they have chosen themselves, and they are alone. And the fear seems validated, but this aloneness is different than the loneliness they experienced while silent. This aloneness is clean. It is honest. It is the aloneness of integrity rather than the loneliness of abandonment. But distinguishing between the two requires sitting with it long enough to feel the difference, and most people do not want to sit with it. They want to run back to what is familiar, to relationships that require their silence but provide the illusion of connection, to patterns that hurt but feel like home. Staying in the aloneness requires faith. Faith that on the other side of this transition is something better. Faith that relationships built on authenticity, though fewer, are more nourishing than relationships built on performance. Faith that their voice, though it has cost them some connections, will eventually create deeper ones. This faith is difficult to maintain, especially when the evidence is not yet visible, when the person is actively losing relationships but has not yet gained new ones, when they are practicing voice but it still feels terrifying, when they are choosing honesty but it still leads to conflict. The middle of healing is unglamorous. It is not the dramatic moment of finally speaking up. It is the daily grind of continuing to speak up, even when it does not feel revolutionary anymore, even when it is still difficult. Even when the rewards are not immediate, it is saying no for the 100th time and still feeling the tightness in the throat. It is expressing a need and still bracing for rejection. It is setting a boundary and still feeling guilty. The responses do not disappear just because the person is healing. They lessen, but they persist. And living with the persistence requires resilience that the person may not have known they possessed. There are also moments when the person speaks and regrets it, not because speaking was wrong, but because the response is difficult. The other person becomes defensive, or hurt, or angry, and the person thinks, "This is why I stayed silent. This is what I was protecting against." And they are partially right. Speaking does sometimes lead to discomfort, does sometimes create conflict, does sometimes result in others being upset. But the question is not whether speaking creates discomfort. The question is whether the discomfort of speaking is less costly than the discomfort of silence. And for someone who has spent years silencing themselves, the answer is not always clear. Because the discomfort of speaking is immediate and visible. The other person's upset is right there, undeniable. But the discomfort of silence is slow and internal. It accumulates quietly. It does not announce itself, so it is easier to dismiss. The person has to learn to weigh these discomforts differently, to recognize that immediate discomfort is not necessarily worse than chronic discomfort. That visible conflict is not necessarily more damaging than invisible self-abandonment. This recalibration is cognitive work, but it is also somatic work, because the body still responds to immediate discomfort with alarm. The body still wants to restore peace quickly. The body still interprets others' upset as threat. So the person has to practice sitting with others' discomfort without immediately trying to fix it. Has to practice letting tension exist without rushing to resolve it. Has to practice trusting that relationships can hold disagreement without dissolving. And this practice is excruciating, because every fibre of their being is screaming to smooth things over, to take back what they said, to apologize, to restore the other person's comfort at the expense of their own truth. Resisting this urge feels like resisting gravity. It feels unnatural, it feels wrong, but it is necessary. Because if they always prioritize the other person's comfort over their own honesty, they will return to silence. And returning to silence after tasting voice is a different kind of death. The person also has to learn what to do with the anger that emerges when they stop silencing themselves. Because beneath the silence is often rage. Rage at the years spent suppressing themselves. Rage at the relationships that benefited from their silence. Rage at the childhood that taught them voice was dangerous. This rage is valid, but it is also difficult to manage, because the person is not used to feeling anger, let alone expressing it. And when anger does surface, it often comes out sideways, as passive aggression, as sarcasm, as withdrawal. Learning to express anger directly, cleanly, without it being contaminated by years of suppression, is a skill the person has to develop, and it is not easy, because direct anger feels aggressive, feels mean, feels like they are becoming the difficult person they have spent their life avoiding becoming. But expressing anger is not the same as being cruel. Setting a boundary is not the same as being harsh. Saying quote 50 quote is not the same as attacking. The person has to learn these distinctions, has to learn that honesty and kindness can coexist, that they can be truthful without being brutal, that their voice can be firm without being violent, and this learning happens through trial and error. The person says something too harshly, they overcorrect and say it too softly, they struggle to find the tone that is honest but not punishing, and sometimes they get it right, and sometimes they do not, and both outcomes teach them something. There is also the grief that continues long after the initial wave, grief that resurfaces at unexpected moments. The person is doing well, they are using their voice more, they are building healthier relationships, and then they encounter something that reminds them of the years they spent silent, and the grief floods back. Grief that they cannot reclaim that time. Grief that certain relationships ended because they started speaking. Grief that they were taught to believe their voice was dangerous. Grief that they believed it for so long. This grief is not a sign that healing is not working. It is a sign that healing is happening. Because grief is the process of releasing what was lost, and the person lost years, lost relationships, lost versions of themselves that never got to exist because they were too busy being quiet. Allowing this grief without trying to rush through it is important, because the grief carries information. It carries the weight of what mattered, and honouring that weight is part of honouring themselves. The person also has to navigate the confusion that comes from mixed responses to their voice. Some people welcome it, some people resist it, some people are inconsistent, welcoming it sometimes and resenting it other times. This inconsistency is crazy-making, because the person cannot predict how their voice will be received, and prediction is what they have relied on to feel safe. If they could predict the response, they could control the outcome, but now they cannot predict, and this loss of control is deeply unsettling. They have to learn to tolerate the uncertainty, to speak without knowing how it will be received, to express themselves without being able to guarantee acceptance. This is vulnerability in its purest form, and vulnerability feels like standing naked in a room full of people who may or may not turn away. But it is also the only path to authentic connection, because connection that is controlled is not connection, it is management, and the person is trying to move away from management and toward genuine relating. This means accepting that sometimes their voice will be rejected, sometimes their truth will not be received well, sometimes their honesty will create distance, and they cannot control any of it. They can only control whether they speak, and choosing to speak, knowing they cannot control the response, is courage. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind, the kind that shows up daily even when it is still frightening. The person also begins to notice patterns in who welcomes their voice and who does not. And these patterns are revealing. Often, the people who resist the person's voice are people who have something to lose when the person speaks. People who have been benefiting from the person's silence. People whose comfort has been dependent on the person's accommodation. Recognizing this is painful, because it means acknowledging that some relationships were never mutual, were never about them being valued for who they are, were always about them being useful in their silence. But it is also clarifying, because it helps the person understand that the resistance is not about them being wrong to speak. It is about the other person losing something they have taken for granted, and that is not the person's responsibility to maintain. The person is not responsible for protecting others from the consequences of their own unwillingness to engage mutually. They are only responsible for their own honesty. And this shift in responsibility is liberating, even though it feels selfish at first, even though it goes against everything they were taught, even though it means some people will be unhappy with them, because the alternative is spending their life managing everyone else's comfort while their own self disappears, and that is a cost they can no longer afford. There are also moments of deep satisfaction that emerge as the person continues to practice voice. Moments when they express something difficult and it goes well. Moments when they set a boundary and it is respected. Moments when they share their authentic opinion and someone says thank you for saying that. These moments feel like sunlight breaking through clouds. They feel like proof that the risk was worth it, that speaking does not always lead to loss, that sometimes speaking leads to deeper connection, and the person holds on to these moments. They remember them when the fear returns, when the urge to retreat into silence resurfaces, when the old pattern tries to reassert itself, they remember that voice can create connection, not just destroy it. And this memory becomes fuel. Fuel to keep practicing. Fuel to keep speaking. Fuel to keep choosing honesty even when it is uncomfortable. The person also begins to develop a different relationship with conflict. Conflict is no longer existential threat. It is information. It signals that something needs to be addressed, that expectations are misaligned, that needs are not being met. And instead of avoiding conflict by staying silent, the person begins to see conflict as an opportunity for clarity. This does not mean they enjoy conflict. Most people do not. But they no longer fear it the way they once did. They have learned that conflict, when navigated honestly, can lead to deeper understanding, can lead to relationships that are more authentic, can lead to needs being expressed and potentially met. And this shift in how they view conflict changes how they move through the world. They are less reactive, less afraid, less likely to sacrifice themselves to avoid tension. They become people who can tolerate discomfort in service of honesty. And this is a profound change from who they were, from the person who would sacrifice anything to avoid a moment of tension. The healing continues in this way, through practice, through choosing voice over silence repeatedly until voice begins to feel more natural than silence, through relationships that reconfigure or end or deepen based on whether they can hold the person's authentic expression, through the slow, unglamorous work of showing up as themselves even when it is still difficult. And eventually, though it takes longer than the person wishes, something shifts. The voice that once felt like a foreign object becomes familiar. The discomfort that accompanied speaking lessens. The fear that preceded honesty diminishes, not entirely, but enough that speaking is no longer the monumental act it once was. It becomes simply what they do, not perfectly, not without occasional retreats into silence, but consistently enough that the pattern has shifted. They are no longer someone who silences themselves to keep the peace. They are someone who speaks to create authentic peace. Peace that includes their voice. Peace that allows for disagreement. Peace that is built on honesty rather than suppression. And this peace, though it required losing some of the false peace they once maintained, is worth everything it cost.